turn of the century, with over 15,000 miles of track crisscrossing the country, trains were very much a part of the landscape. The railways had not yet reached the stage where everybody was using them. The main users were still the middle classes. Working class people may have gone on occasional journeys, but they were not habitual railway travellers. They were to be found servicing the network. The railways pay the wages of 1 in 20 of the population, many of whom were without job security, employed only on a daily basis. "13,000 men were employed in the workshops at Crewe, Darlington, Swindon and Derby. As well as providing engines for the railways of Britain, they supplied trains and equipment for many foreign railways. The working conditions were terrifying. Accidents happened almost every day, and most of the men became stone deaf. Although the railway industry looked secure at the turn of the century, many individual companies were fighting for survival. The losers were swallowed up by their more successful rivals at a remarkable rate. As the 20th century began, 300 companies were listed. 15 years later, only 120 were left. This map, with only 12 of the companies, gives some indication of the flaws in this highly competitive arrangement. A simple journey could take the traveller across 3 territories. If the companies involved were active rivals, the passenger would find the connections made deliberately awkward. The scale of the problem multiplied because the rest of the network was divided between the other 112 companies, some operating only a few miles of line. Another cause of conflict was that the companies had a strong regional character and operated as little empires bordered by hostile neighbours. The competition was encouraged by the creation of company styles, which made the property of each company instantly recognisable. The companies stamped their ownership on almost everything. The obsessional emphasis on company identity helped to encourage loyalty from the traveller. Company identity was also used to produce a servile workforce. Carrying the insignia was meant to engender a sense of pride. Traces of the old companies have survived in today's network. This relic of the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway can be seen at Victoria Station. Initials of former companies appear like ghosts of the past on fixtures and fittings of the present system. These station awnings show that this was Great Eastern Territory. Each company built in its own style, and some of the buildings still survive in the different regions of British Rail. These were the more picturesque elements of competition, but there was a more sinister side. The crash at Salisbury was caused by excessive speed. One company was trying to prove itself faster than another. The disaster at Aysgill killed 14 people. One reason was cost-cutting. The use of ungraded coal caused loss of power at a crucial moment. The train stopped and another train ran into it. These disasters were a reflection of an industry with deep-rooted problems and an uncertain future. But before any solution could be contemplated, competition was forced to a halt. The events of 1914 brought all available transport into the war. Even the London buses were used in France. But with the internal combustion engine still in its infancy, the railways assumed the major role. The government took control of the railways and placed day-to-day operations in the hands of a committee of company managers. This was not state ownership, but the railways were unified and the government was ultimately in charge. Wartime cooperation gave some hope for the future. There could be no return to the pre-war level of competition. In 1919, the railways were given further recognition with the establishment of the Ministry of Transport. Plans for nationalising the network were underway, but under pressure from the railway lobby, the minister opted for the enforced merger of the 120 companies into just 4 groups. By 1923, the old companies had been pushed into one or other of the 4 groups. The East and North East became the territory of the London and North Eastern Railway. The London, Midland and Scottish Railway operated in the Midlands and the North. The Southern Railway ran a service all along the south coast. In the west of England, the old Great Western swallowed up some small lines and became the new Great Western. The Great Western had least need for a new identity. The public image was very much that of the old Great Western, with associations of grandeur and exotic places. The LMS was potentially prosperous, servicing the major industrial areas of the north, and its management was very conscious of its dependence on these industries. It was also the most public relations-minded of the companies. It commissioned Royal Academy artists to produce posters in the 20s, and also maintained its own film unit. The LNER got off to a shaky start because it inherited problems. It promoted its East Coast resorts and its famous Flying Scotsman with great energy, but it lacked the stable commercial traffic of other lines. Its biggest industrial area on Tyneside was in decline. Southern was blessed with a share of the South Coast resorts, and the company introduced the character of Sunny South Sam to promote tourism. Most of its income came from the busy commuter lines in and out of London. The commuters travelled in comfort, thanks to the Southern's programme of modernisation and electrification. It might have looked as if grouping solved the railway's problems, but in fact it was no solution. The Depression hit the railways, and competition from road transport was beginning to bite. The railways fought back, but they were handicapped by regulations forcing them to accept everything for transport. The railways launched the Square Deal campaign for the removal of their obligation to carry everything. This would have enabled them to compete more successfully with road haulage, but soon after the campaign was launched, war intervened again.
A year or so ago, one of the best-known figures in Southern Railway publicity was Sunny South Sam, friendly advisor on all matters regarding healthful holiday resorts and how to reach them. Now the dogs of war have slipped their leash, and once again the Southern plays a star role in a newly arisen state of...
Once again the government stepped in and the railway managers worked together, but the groups maintained their individual identities. An agreement was negotiated which put the whole network at the disposal of the government. In return, the owners were guaranteed a minimum income based on pre-war returns. It looked as if the railways would do very well out of this agreement. In the years before the war, railway income had fluctuated, but since a high point in 1929, the trend was downwards. The guaranteed income was based on 1935 receipts, and allowing for changes in prices and conditions, the figure was fixed at £43.5 million a year. This was more than the railways would have hoped to earn in normal circumstances, but with the war, the traffic load increased, and so income rose sharply. The agreement then worked in favour of the government, since it received any income over the guaranteed amount. Protection of the transport system was of major strategic concern, but there had been few preparations. At the outbreak of war, the fear of what modern weaponry would bring provoked bizarre precautions. Station signs were painted out to confuse the invader. The railways gave priority to building air raid shelters rather than providing new sidings. This hampered efficiency and made life difficult for the railway managers.
I was at the working level of the railway, district offices, managing the movement of trains, allocation of locomotives, getting the traffic going by some means or other. There was a tremendous job to do because we not only had pretty well all the road traffic in the country dumped on the railways, but of course we had the additional military movements, and then we had the Yanks coming over, and so there was a great deal more than we could do efficiently.
Troop movements made immense demands on the railway system, and there was not always time for planning. Little advance warning could be given because of secrecy. On one line, 1,000 men a day were being moved to Southampton. British and foreign troops were constantly being shifted from one transit camp to another. Nearly 1.5 million people in high-risk areas were evacuated by rail. 600,000 went from London alone. It was a complicated exercise involving local and long-distance travel. Some companies and their employees were evacuated en masse. They were easier to organise than the thousands of individuals that the railways had to move. The railways had to cope with special freight traffic, including the transport of armaments and munitions, which meant laying on hundreds of additional unscheduled trains. Ordinary passenger services were disrupted because of these trains, and travellers were asked to take second place.
His train won't be held up much longer, but it had to wait because something much more important has to be got through.
Every available train was running day and night to keep up with the demands of the war, and there was constant pressure on the footplate workers.
The conditions were pretty terrifying. The locomotives were all at night shrouded with a tarpaulin sheet, which was intended to keep the glare from going out in the blackout. And the side windows weren't windows, they were metal. And very often, because of the poor maintenance of the locomotives, the dust from the coal would come swirling into the cab. The cab, if it had a leak of any kind, had a great deal of condensation. So we worked basically in that condition for long, long periods.
The railways ran through the night as usual, but they had to take extra care because of the blackout. With only the faintest of lighting allowed, white paint was daubed everywhere to help both staff and passengers. Coaches had dimmed blue lamps and blackout blinds. Signals and lamps had to be specially shaded.
I can remember one story where a fireman said to his driver, "How did you manage to stop at this particular dark station, which was very poorly lit as well because of the blackout?" And he said, "Well, 2 fields back," he said, "there's a white cow in that field." He said, "As soon as I saw that white cow, I put the brake on, and that stopped me exactly at the station." And after about half an hour, the fireman said to him, "But what if the farmer moves it into another field the next night?" He said, "Oh, well, I need to look for something else then."
Despite the blackout, the railways were often hit. There were over 9,000 incidents involving damage to the network. There was a great fear that railways would be knocked out altogether by enemy action, but in the early years of the war, neither side was capable of doing so.
You didn't bomb railways as such. If you tried, well, you didn't really try. It happened by accident. But we got a lot of holes blown in the railway, more or less by mistake, you know, some lone aircraft letting go, and one would drop in the middle of the railway, and he'd blow a hole 30 feet across and 20 feet deep, and you'd go along with a couple of dozen wagons of old locomotive ashes, and you'd fill the hole in and put plain track over the top, and you'd be operational again in 12 hours.
The task of repairing wasn't so easy in built-up areas, where mountains of rubble had to be dealt with, or the bridges were hit. On top of the strain of war, the severe winter of 1941 almost brought the system to a halt. Despite all the difficulties, passengers poured onto the railways, which were usually the only means of reaching their relatives. There was very little road transport because of petrol rationing. Exports were a vital part of the war effort, helping to pay for imports. The seaborne freight was systematically transferred from East Coast ports to the comparative safety of the West Coast. For the railways, this involved long journeys and a complete change in the pattern of handling freight. During the war, freight traffic almost doubled. There was a great shortage of wagons, but because of the wartime agreement, they were pooled rather than used only by the company which owned them. The railways transported tanks for the Eastern Front on the first leg of their journey to Russia. Britain acted like a clearinghouse for troops and equipment. D-Day was the culmination of a highly effective transport operation that was cloaked in secrecy and stretched the railways to their limits. The network was almost exhausted.
We hadn't any new engines for 6 years. No new wagons, no new passenger carriages, maintenance of track, signalling, locomotives, everything went downhill
Many railway workers had been taken away by the war. Women were taken on to help solve the shortage of labour. They tackled all the jobs that union agreements allowed, but there was no way to make up for the shortage of equipment.
The most important thing on the railway is the locomotive and the driver. You don't get anywhere unless something pulls you. And the maintenance meant that everything was run down, run down, run down. I remember standing next to a big locomotive, freight locomotive in Wath Marshalling Yard in Yorkshire, talking to an inspector. And the side of the cab was tied on with baling wire. And he looked at this thing and he said, "Never has so much been held together by so little." And it wasn't all as bad as that, but we got into some pretty tangles with equipment on locomotives.
The manager's skill and resilience was put to the test, but the workers took the brunt of the strain.
The footplate men and the guards, whose hours could never be measured in the same way as signalmen and other grades, they could only work the hours as the running of the train allowed. Some men worked regularly, 18, 20 hours a day. I was speaking to a fireman here in the southern region just last week, and 1 week he worked 123.5 hours, and his driver worked 132 hours. And that was partly because the railways were very busy. They were moving special trains, military specials, ammunition specials. Much of the production that was going on in the UK was being carried by railways because they could move bulk traffic. So the railway was very, very busy, and much of the traffic was running in an unscheduled way.
Air raids had caused spectacular devastation. The estimated cost of war damage to the railways was over £200 million. But the cost of stress was incalculable. For 6 years, workers and management had achieved a very high standard of efficiency against the terrible odds.
The three railway unions had a collective leadership, and their leadership was devoted to do everything to help to win the war. So that the railway unions and railwomen in general, railway people, they had the key objective that most people had, and that was to win the war and to prevent fascism spreading to the United Kingdom.
The railways worked effectively during the war under unified management, but this was due to go with peacetime. For the railways to continue to be efficient, they would need capital. Much of their equipment was fit only for scrap. New engines would have to be built, and the worn-out track would have to be renewed. To return to the pre-war system of separate managements would increase the problem. Competition hadn't worked. In fact, 2 of the big 4 were near bankruptcy and had survived mainly because of the war. The companies accepted their need for government help. What was at issue was what kind of help. It could involve a takeover, and the railway companies were very much against this.
And if you're a keen train spotter, you may like to have a browse through the Channel 4 book, Losing Track, written by Kerry Hamilton and Stephen Potter, which is on sale in most bookshops for £7.95.